This evening's program is one I've been looking forward to. It continues the series of talks that we've conducted here at the Byrd Center this summer that explore the critical historical moments in which Americans picked up the torch of social justice through organizing and agitating and leveraging just about anything they could in an effort to halt social, cultural, economic, and political inequality in America. Obviously, these conversations are not happening in a vacuum. They are incredibly current and topical, and we're talking about these things one day after the first African-American woman is nominated to be Vice President of the United States. So I don't know that you could get much more timely or topical than this. Our hope is that these programs can provide some historical context and help inform those critical debates that we're undertaking right now about race, about ethnicity, about gender, about sexuality, class, and social justice. So that is our hope. And we're super happy to have tonight's featured speaker. She's no stranger to the Byrd Center. Dr. Julia Sandy is Associate Professor of History at Shepherd University. We've collaborated on numerous projects over the years, although I think this may be the first time you're doing your original talk on original research. So I'm really excited.
Right, actually, I think you're right about that.
Yeah, so it's gonna be great. In addition to teaching modern American history courses, Julia teaches classes on public history, world history, women's history, and African-American history. So sort of we're kindred souls in this sort of the jack of all historical trades sort of realm. Julia's published articles on consumer activism in Harlem, on oral history projects in Massachusetts, and she's currently at work on a book manuscript about the civil rights movement in New York City from the Great Depression to the 1960s. Julia's talk tonight, which is titled No Innocent Bystanders, The Power and Responsibility of Local Action, focuses on the later years of that era, the 1960s, and the ways in which civil rights activists in New York used the advantages of their location to support and help cultivate a much broader movement for Black freedom. And so I'm going to turn things over to Julia. But before I do so, I also want to remind you all that if you like these programs, if you've enjoyed these programs that we've conducted over the summer, please consider going to byrdcenter.org and making a contribution to support the Byrd Center. Our programs are donor supported, and we cannot conduct them without your ongoing support and generosity. So we very much appreciate your support, and we depend on it. So I'm going to turn it over to Julia, and I'm going to mute my microphone now and let you take it away.
Great, thank you. And before I start my presentation, I do want to give a shout out to the Byrd Center. We have collaborated on many projects over the years. And I know I'm speaking to the choir. You are all supporters of the Byrd Center, but to have an archive of this significance on a small campus and to have the personnel that we have had, starting off with Ray Smock and now Jay and Jody is kind of astounding. And certainly our community, but also my students would be the poorer if we didn't have the Byrd Center any longer. So I just wanted to kind of give that shout out. I always love doing things with the Byrd Center. Okay, now I'm going to share my screen. And hopefully that will be visible to everyone. Again, Jay, you can text or just jump in if for some reason things don't seem to be working the way they're supposed to be. I also realized too, I know there's like sometimes it mirrors, sometimes it doesn't. So if I'm referring to something on the right and it's really on the left, you can assume I do know my right from my left, but the technology has gotten in my way. So again, thank you, Dr. Wyatt. I'm really happy to be here tonight to share this presentation. This is a topic, so as Jay said, I'm working on a book on the civil rights movement in New York City and really kind of the intersection of the civil rights movement in Madison Avenue in New York City, starting in the 30s, and coming up through the 60s. But what I'm going to talk about tonight is slightly off of that topic. It's still certainly in the ballpark, but it's something that I've really been thinking about more intently just for the last few years. I've been working on it off and on since 2016, but the events of 2020 have certainly intensified my desire to know more about social movements and how they work, and how people can be a part of those movements wherever they are. So it's about New York City. It's not about the Eastern Panhandle, but certainly I think that what I've been working on in terms of this presentation, to me at least, speaks to what's going on in 2020 as well. But we can talk more about that in the Q&A afterwards. See if I can get this to work. Okay. Here we go. Okay, so September 22nd, 1963, James Farmer, then National Director of the Congress of Racial Equality, and he's here right next to James Baldwin. So James Farmer, Director of CORE, as it was known, spoke at a protest rally in front of the Justice Department offices in New York City. More than 10,000 people attended the Foley Square event, designed to pressure the federal government into finding and punishing those responsible for the infamous church bombing of a few weeks prior, which murdered 4 young African-American girls at the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, Alabama. In his speech, Farmer denounced Southern racial violence. He spoke of electric cattle prods used by state troopers in Alabama, of children trampled by police horses in Louisiana, and of his own jailing and harassment as a freedom rider. He urged his New York City, his northern audience, to relate to the struggles of Southern Blacks, arguing, quote, "When the dogs bite our people in Birmingham or in Mississippi, we bleed all over the country." However, Farmer was not only asking that New Yorkers sympathize with Southern victims and work for their movement, he also connected Southern struggles to those faced by the Black community in New York City. "Mourn not the dead," he shouted. "Mourn rather the torturous living." But where were those tortured lives? In Birmingham, to be sure, but they were also found in New York City and in communities throughout the nation. And this is another quote from this speech. "We have found that the fire hoses that roll women over into the Southern streets merely build up the demand for freedom in New York, in Chicago, and in California." Farmer argued that just as shameful as the Birmingham bomb were the deplorable conditions in which Black children lived in Brooklyn, that the same police brutality found in Louisiana or Alabama was found in New York, and that menial jobs and a shortened life expectancy awaited all children born with dark skin. "In Harlem, you didn't hear the bomb blast," Farmer declared, "but it was still killing children there too." Farmer held responsible those who he referred to as the fools and beasts of Birmingham, but he also held responsible urban slumlords, Northern state troopers, the Kennedy administration, and of course, the Justice Department, whose offices were the backdrop of the rally. He also indicted those at the rally who went home and failed to join the movement, arguing, quote, "There are no innocent bystanders now." The audience was urged to fight racism in all its forms wherever it existed, in the South, New York City, and everywhere. This rally, at which Bayard Rustin, James Baldwin, and others also spoke, received front page coverage in the New York Times. And you can see over here to the right, the kind of full page view and then a close-up of one of the photos of this rally. So it received front page coverage in the New York Times and was also written up in newspapers around the country. James Baldwin called it, quote, "a somewhat hideous sequel to the March on Washington," which had just taken place a month prior to the Foley Square event. Farmer's argument, and again, here's Baldwin and Farmer on the end. So Farmer's argument in front of Justice Department offices that both racial injustice and the movement against it were national in scope would not have surprised his audience, and it doesn't surprise contemporary historians either. For decades, scholars have widened our understanding of the civil rights movement, both geographically and chronologically. And when a lot of historians talk about this movement, they actually refer to it as the Black Freedom Movement instead of the Civil Rights Movement, to try to break us out of this focus on just the South, just kind of Montgomery bus boycott to maybe Voting Rights Act. You know, certainly when I talk to my students and I say, what was the Civil Rights Movement? They're going to say Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, March on Washington, but it's a really kind of very Southern focused, very just this one decade focus. So historians have taken to calling the long struggle for racial equality the Black Freedom Movement, to again trying to decenter this idea of it being just this one kind of moment in time. So because of that, we know now much more about movements in Oakland, Los Angeles, Milwaukee, Philadelphia, Chicago, and a host of other places. A number of studies have focused specifically on the movement in New York City. Thanks to their work, we know that activists there organized and protested about a variety of problems faced by Black New Yorkers: employment discrimination, school segregation, disfranchisement, police brutality, racial violence, and residential segregation. The Black Freedom Movement was all over the place, which has led historians to feel a bit all over the place ourselves. What was it? If it wasn't just Martin Luther King in the South, if it was all over the place, stretching back in time, stretching forward in time, was it just a bunch of local movements, or was there an actual national movement? My answer to that is this talk, which is yes, it was a local movement and it was a national movement as well. So tonight I want to focus on the ways in which Black activists in New York City not only worked for a vibrant, interconnected movement beyond their community, but especially to think about how in the early 60s, they used the particular advantages of their location to take up farmers' call to action. As home to numerous corporate headquarters, the national offices of many Black rights organizations, the UN, and also important news outlets such as the Associated Press, United Press International, and the New York Times, the city's Black rights activists were able to capitalize on their location's strengths to articulate to a national audience their vision of a collective and connected movement. For this talk, I will not focus on the numerous ways in which New York activists work to advance racial justice in their own community, although as I'm going to try to demonstrate, they really didn't kind of parse out their own struggles from those in other parts of the country. That New York activists' work to help campaigns and communities around the nation was hardly unique, and my goal isn't to prove that New York City was exceptional or more important to the movement than in other cities. Instead, I'm using this opportunity to think about how activists there use the peculiarities of their community to work at once, both locally and nationally. In so doing, I hope to give us food for thought about our own moment here in 2020 and how we might use our particular resources to affect change in the Eastern Panhandle and also in other areas of the nation. Okay, so let's go back to the 60s. One of the key aims of the Southern Civil Rights Movement was to shine a spotlight on Jim Crow in the South for national audiences and really even international audiences, so that these outside forces could embarrass the South and compel their governments and the federal government to end Southern violence and discrimination. New York City activists readily did their part to bring these struggles to light for Northern and national audiences. Black New Yorkers staged protests at stores, corporate headquarters, and government offices, receiving notice in the New York Times and therefore also in newspapers around the country. There are numerous examples of this in the 60s, starting with New Yorkers' support for the lunch counter sit-ins. And this is probably a photo you've seen before, a very famous photo of the sit-in in Greensboro that launched the sit-in movement of the 60s. One might even say launched the 60s. As they did in communities elsewhere, the February 1960 sit-ins at the Greensboro Woolworths ignited sympathy protests in New York City. Although northern stores were not segregated. So here there are lots of protests in New York City. Here's one in front of Woolworths in Harlem, which is not segregated. So although these northern stores were not segregated and Woolworths in New York City employed African Americans in sales and other jobs, activists there immediately began picketing Woolworths and soon S.H. Kress and W.T. Grant stores throughout the 5 boroughs. By March, New York activists, led by local and national offices, and this is sometimes really an interesting relationship to look at. Sometimes the local branches can be much more radical than the national offices, but they're all inhabiting the same space, the same streets, really. So led by local and national offices of CORE, the NAACP, and the Urban League, they held rallies, launched boycotts and letter writing campaigns, raised money and sent volunteers to Southern sit-ins, and eventually staged pickets at over 100 stores in the city and surrounding suburbs, and also the Woolworths headquarters in Lower Manhattan. Joining them on the picket line was an assortment of Black rights and interracial groups, including the local including local Black and white churches, the American Jewish Congress, the National Student Association, the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, the AFL-CIO, and the United Auto Workers. Rallies throughout the spring and summer were attended by thousands of white and Black New Yorkers. And I should pause here to say too, that there's this kind of slide on the side that has people's pictures in it, and you can, yourself choose whether or not to see me talking or other people there, or to mute it. So if there's something on a slide you can't see, feel free to move that around. So there are lots of these rallies that are going on. Frequent speakers included local celebrities, Jackie Robinson, Congressman Adam Clayton Powell, and even the former Miss Alabama and Miss America, and you see her here. Yolanda Beezy Fox, who told the New York Times, "I'm a Southern girl, but I'm a thinking girl." So she'd been Miss Alabama and then Miss America. The AP, UPI, and New York Times gave this local work extensive coverage, and Black and white newspapers throughout the country often picked up these stories. The focus was on supporting the Southern campaign, but the activities of Black New Yorkers demonstrated the national relevance of these sit-ins. News stories about these pickets emphasized the wide array of groups involved, the militancy of their protests, how youthful the activists were, and their arguments linking Southern Jim Crow to problems in their own communities. In a number of reports, activists brought up the UN's Declaration on Human Rights, demanding that American society live up to those principles too. They also called on Congress and the Eisenhower administration to intervene in the South and argued that, quote, democracy was not possible without equality. That spring, representatives from the national CORE offices, headquartered in New York City, met with Woolworths management, also headquartered in New York City. And although these meetings took place, they did not result in any official policy change. Like other chain stores, Woolworths management attempted to end these sympathy campaigns by arguing the decision to segregate their stores was simply a matter of abiding by local practices. Quote, the customs are already established, explained a company vice president. As individual merchants, we can't change a thing. When in Rome, do as the Romans do. Sitting groups and sympathy protests, however, continued. Targeted stores initially reported that New York protests did not affect their sales, but as the protests wore on, many picketers claimed almost vacant lunch counters wherever they marched. As this national campaign expanded, many cities and towns in the South continued to enforce lunch counter segregation laws, but a number quietly changed their practices by the end of the summer. And this is true especially of chains. So the individually owned chain stores get to decide for themselves, but as people are launching these protests all over the nation, these big chain stores like Woolworths, like W.T. Grant, are going to be much more likely to integrate their lunch counters in the South than the mom and pop stores are there. So there is this kind of national pressure that's brought to bear. Sympathy protests in New York City, as in other communities, connected activists to a large national movement. Furthermore, core activists internationalized this connection when, on March 26th, 200 protesters picketed Woolworths on 42nd Street and then marched to the South African consulate on Madison Avenue, where they demonstrated for an hour in protest of the Sharpeville massacre 5 days prior that left 69 anti-pass law protesters dead in South Africa. This march symbolically linked American racism and South African apartheid, and also demonstrated the commitment of New Yorkers to protest against racial injustice wherever it occurred. Pickets also went on at the United Nations when the UN Security Council held an emergency meeting to discuss the Sharpeville massacre. Throughout the spring of 1960, groups continued to protest at the South African consulate and also the UN. While most of the initial New York City lunch counter protests ended in the fall of 1960, Black New Yorkers returned to this tactic of local pickets at Manhattan-based institutions again and again throughout the 1960s. In May of 1961, for example, over 800 core activists picketed trailways and Greyhound buses at the Port Authority bus terminal to protest bus segregation and support freedom riders. In 1963, and again, you might need to move the kind of box on the corner if you want to see the article a little bit more closely. In 1963, New York's SNCC activists were joined by locals of the International Ladies Garment Workers Union in protest at the Manhattan headquarters of Dan River Mills, Inc. These protests, which went on all throughout the spring and summer of that year, supported Black activists in Danville, Virginia, who were trying to increase Black employment at the company's textile mills there, and also end the incredibly brutal local Jim Crow system. In addition to their picketing of the company's Manhattan offices, the local SNCC branch also sent New Yorkers to Danville and collected donations, food, and clothing for Virginia activists. So they're doing a lot of work locally to support this effort in Danville. And you see in the middle here is a flyer that was sent out kind of telling people to join in this action. And then you see that it's picked up here in the New York Times. The United Nations continued to be an active location for protests throughout the 60s as well. In 1962, for example, the Harlem Anti-Colonial Committee held rallies and marches at the United Nations to protest South African apartheid and also the blockade of Cuba. Despite having what was described as a sparse, rain-drenched audience at one of their rallies, they still received coverage in the New York Times. And an emerging of political and economic pressure by the mid-60s, and this is what you're seeing here on the slide, by the mid-60s, groups added to their UN protests the picketing of corporate headquarters of American businesses in an attempt to get them to divest their economic interests in South Africa. In the spring of 1963, another intense wave of protests began in New York City in support of Martin Luther King and the SCLC's campaign in Birmingham. And these are, again, photos that you've probably seen. They're very famous photos of this Birmingham campaign. It was called Project C. C stood for confrontation. The SCLC had suffered from a series of either kind of defeats, or maybe we could say they were draws in cities in the South. And so they targeted Birmingham because it was the most known as the most racist city in the South. And they also believed that the reaction to it would probably be extreme, which, as you can see here in these pictures, it was. And so this would be something that would get, again, more national and international attention. As the violent response to the Birmingham movement shocked the nation, Black New Yorkers again worked locally in protest against racism that they understood to be national in scope. And this is interesting. This is a memo in which the FBI is explaining some of the activities that have been going on in New York City in July of 1963. And as you can see, they're kind of going on all over the place. Activists in New York City threw up picket lines, again, around the city's Woolworth, Press and H.L. Green stores, and at the home of the offices of J.J. Newberry. All of these are located in Manhattan, and they all had segregated stores in Birmingham. These protests continued throughout the spring and summer, receiving repeated notice in the New York Times, whose coverage was picked up by white and black newspapers across the nation. National offices and also local branches of CORE, SNCC, and the NAACP organized these protests, and as they did before, interracial religious and labor organizations often joined them. After the September church bombing of this year, in 1963, New Yorkers waged a massive public campaign against Birmingham and any person, company, or group they felt abetted white supremacy there. In addition to daily picketing of chain stores and their headquarters, CORE and SNCC activists picketed the U.S. Steel building on Broadway, demanding that the company, which operated plants in Birmingham, do more to end racial violence and injustice there. U.S. Steel's spokesperson met with 8 of the demonstration leaders and passed on a petition to the company's executive. Black New Yorkers also used local protests to pressure the Kennedy administration into action in Birmingham. Attorney General Robert Kennedy faced protests every single time he came to New York City that fall. Activists wanted the Justice Department to find the guilty parties in Birmingham and for President Kennedy to force passage of the Civil Rights Act, which was kind of languishing in Congress at this point. In October, a UPI story reported that members of New York's CORE demonstrated in front of a Manhattan hotel where Kennedy spoke to a convention of theater owners of America. 80 activists marched, shouted, and sang while Kennedy was inside. And a spokesperson for the group said, quote, "The Kennedy brothers sold us out by trying to water down a strong civil rights bill." And here you can see some of the newspaper articles that are talking about the protests when Kennedy arrived. The next month, New York CORE activists again protested Robert Kennedy, this time staging a demonstration in front of the Hilton Hotel in Manhattan where he was speaking. They again called Kennedy a sellout because the administration wasn't doing more to find those responsible for the bombing in Birmingham or push through the Civil Rights Act. That protest was one day before another Birmingham-related event, which took place in front of the ABC studios when Governor George Wallace was interviewed there for the Les Crane show. CORE charged that New York City police were attacking protesters at both demonstrations, saying that, quote, "patrolmen had struck demonstrators with clubs and mounted policemen had ridden their horses over some demonstrators who had sat down on the pavement." This description would have seemed to the readers of the New York Times, where this story was reported, and to readers of those papers around the country who repeated the story to demonstrate the same type of police brutality that we had seen in Birmingham. State-sponsored violence wasn't a singularly Southern problem. Indeed, as with lunch counter sit-ins, South African apartheid, and the countless other issues Black New Yorkers protested in the early 60s, their demonstrations against Birmingham were picked up by news services and the New York Times, which ensured that their local work flooded into newspapers across the country and even internationally. And here are some examples of this that kind of gets us back to the first rally that I talked about at the beginning. That Foley Square event that I described at the beginning of the talk was covered by all of these outlets, AP, UPI, the New York Times, and you can see here, this is United Press International, this is Associated Press. So all of these news outlets being in New York City, plus the New York Times service, is going to take these protests and spread them across the nation. And you can see here lots of different places where these went: Montana, internationally into Canada, Alabama, Wisconsin, Texas, St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Battle Creek Michigan Inquirer, the Decatur Daily Review. Many of these newspapers also included the AP report on smaller Bronx and Queens protests, where demonstrators wore black armbands and carried four small coffins. So it wasn't just this big rally that got attention, it was smaller ones as well. Readers opening up the Southern Illinoisian in Carbondale, Illinois, heard farmer, Rustin, and other speakers articulate a vision of the civil rights struggle that linked racism and the campaigns against it in communities across the nation. Other national newspapers, such as the Washington Post, Boston Globe, and LA Times, also sent their own reporters to cover large rallies in New York City, extending the reach of the protests there. But even smaller protests could end up with extensive national coverage. In the fall of 1964, for example, 150 core activists, and that's not really that many, 150 core activists, again led by James Farmer, staged a rally in front of the Manhattan FBI offices to demand an investigation into the Freedom Summer murders of James Chaney, Andrew Goodman, and Michael Schwerner. Goodman and Schwerner, by the way, also New Yorkers. This event was reported by the New York Times and distributed by its news service. And you can see all of these articles here are through that New York Times news service, with headlines like Reign of Terror and Corps Director Charges Sheriff Gave Trio to Mob, which was true, by the way. Papers around the country gave a national audience to this relatively small group of protesters. Now, while much of the activism I've discussed in this paper supported Southern campaigns, Black New Yorkers also took advantage of their location to help activists in other parts of the country. In the spring and summer of 1964, New York City's local branches and national leaders from CORE, NAACP, and the Urban League picketed General Motors offices in Manhattan in support of a campaign underway in Detroit to increase Black employment in GM auto plants. So they're helping activists in Detroit try to gain employment for African Americans at GM plants. Now the company's headquarters, GM headquarters, remained in Detroit, but their offices on 57th Street in Manhattan were the site of a massive automobile showroom, their marketing headquarters, and GMAC, the company's financing department. Eugene Sharp, chair of the New York NAACP's Labor and Industries Committee, told reporters that, quote, some sort of campaign will be going on all the time among the New York branches. Additionally, CORE's 7 Arts chapter, which focused on discrimination in the performing arts, picketed GM headquarters and also the International Automobile Show that was held in the city. Their protests supported the Detroit campaign and also the company's exclusion of African American models and demonstrators at the show. On April 8th, GM executives flew from Detroit to New York City and met with national civil rights leaders, Whitney Young, Roy Wilkins, and James Farmer, as well as directors of local CORE and SNCC chapters. When GM refused to set up a committee to encourage the hiring and promotion of African Americans in its plants, the 3 organizations continued their protests. For 3 years, these groups kept up intermittent pressure against GM, and in 1967, their efforts helped Black workers in Detroit finally succeed. These are just a few of the examples that indicate in the 1960s, Black New Yorkers pushed a militant and unrelenting agenda designed to meet racial injustice wherever it appeared. They demanded that corporate America, the federal government, and each individual, regardless of race, join the struggle or be just as guilty as those wielding dogs and bombs. They used the advantages of location to make sure that their campaigns made the connections between multiple sites of injustice and received a widespread audience. Despite all of these demonstrations for other campaigns, they actively worked for fairer employment, housing, policing, and schools in their own neighborhoods as well. That they spent so much of their time and resources supporting activists in other areas of the country demonstrates how much they believed their struggles to be part of an interconnected movement that of necessity had to be at once both local and national. All right, I'm going to stop my screen share here so we can.
Okay, fantastic, Julia. Thank you so much. Does anyone have any questions for Julia? I mean, I'm always happy to start. I have plenty of questions, but certainly I'll open up to the floor. And you can use your chat box if you want to submit a question. As we're sort of waiting for them to come in, one of the things that struck me immediately was just the really omnipresent, prominence of labor in all of this. And, we sort of, those of us who study these things, you hear about the UAW and Walter Reuther and all of that kind of stuff, but this seems really a lot more widespread. Is that something that these activists really had to go out and sort of generate that support, or was there a prolonged solidarity?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The unions could be sometimes a hindrance. Certainly in the Detroit case, the activists there trying to gain employment for African Americans had to contend with the unions. It wasn't as much as fighting with the corporate headquarters, but certainly they had to contend with unions who were somewhat reluctant. But at the same time, unions, especially kind of local branches of unions, but depending on how big the demonstration was, even national spokespeople for these unions or leaders of these unions were very interested in supporting the civil rights movement. Again, I think it kind of depended on what the action was. The March on Washington, unions very, very kind of visibly and famously participated in that. But Definitely they're a huge presence. And for Black rights organizations, they really wanted that interracial connection. They really reached out to religious groups. Religious groups were much more likely than really almost any other white organization to support these campaigns. But labor unions were pretty much always in there, in the ones at least that I've looked at in New York City in the 60s.
And were they predominantly integrated? I'm from Philadelphia, so it's, they're sort of famous for the lack of integration in their labor unions.
Yeah, there was integration, to be sure, but kind of just enough to say there was integration. And that's always, to me, and I'm not an expert on the labor movement, but there is this kind of giving voice to social justice issues for African Americans on the part of labor unions, but the nuts and bolts of actually integrating those unions was always a struggle. It was always very behind. My work starts in the 30s in New York City, and integrating unions and getting unions to even uphold federal policies that were designed to integrate work was always very difficult. It was always kind of clawing at it little bit by little bit.
Like so much else of the movement.
Yes, absolutely.
So I'm going to kind of, as you all send in your questions, I'm going to try to answer that, keep sort of the line of thought going. So I may sort of put them to Julia a little bit out of order, but Lynn has asked, have you focused at all on the nature and processes of coordination among the various groups, meetings, phone calls, coordinating councils, means of resolving conflicts? So this is kind of thinking along these sort of same lines about how they're actually doing it.
Right. What I will say that what I have found, to the extent that I've looked at it, is, and this is one of the things that I try to talk to my students about when we talk about the 60s. And by the way, what a great moment in time to be talking about the 60s. The summer class that I taught this summer, we talked a lot about the 60s, and the students kept saying, it's just like today. It's just like today. Yeah. One of the things that sometimes we do as historians is we try to kind of silo some of these movements off. There was the student protests, the anti-war protests, the civil rights protests. But what I'm seeing is a lot of the same activists are popping up in multiple organizations. So I think a lot of this was simply that kind of cross-pollination. You're also seeing people just out on the streets all the time. I had in those slides just a few kind of leaflets saying, hey, show up tomorrow for this protest. But when I look at the archives and read the newspapers, you almost get a sense sometimes that people are just walking around waiting for a protest to emerge that they just kind of pick up onto. There was something going on all the time. And again, I think living in 2020, we can kind of understand what that felt like. I mean, there certainly are problems going on all the time, but there are also people really actively working to try to highlight those or solve those all the time as well. And this is, what I found so fascinating was how much activists in New York City were in newspapers in South Dakota and Montana and Arizona and internationally. And even again, that's one of my favorite ones, is this group of 150 people. I've seen ones of 14 people show up at the offices of some headquarters, and they're in the newspaper in France. Like, it's just amazing to me at the reach that these New York activists had to really speak to people who are also on their streets doing similar work, right? This is not just going on in New York City. And I kind of said at the beginning, New York City certainly has particular advantages, but one of the things that I like about thinking in the middle of this project is what do we have? What are the advantages that each location really has to think about how they can affect change where they are, but also support nationally as well. And certainly in an age of social media, one of the big stories has been how many protests are going on in these little tiny small towns that probably never had a civil rights protest there before.
And that leads to the next question, and which is to say, you highlight a lot of the role that newspapers play in this. Are these protests, are they getting picked up on network TV in the same way that, the protests in the South and, dogs and fire hoses, getting turned on little kids are, or is this kind of secondary to all of that?
It is secondary, and that's a harder story to uncover. But from what I've seen, the bigger protests, if Farmer and Baldwin and Bayard Rustin are there, and there's 10,000 people at Foley Square, that's going to get radio coverage, TV coverage. The smaller 150 people marching over to the UN occasionally, those aren't going to be picked up on TV. Those are getting kind of, again, as far as I can tell, those are really getting overwhelmed by the larger protests going on all over the country, right? They're going to show the fire hoses and the dogs in Birmingham. They're not going to show 150 people at the FBI headquarters in New York City.
Sure. So just sort of a follow-up question then too. Do you think that the reason for the widespread press coverage had anything to do with the fact that newspapers tended to be more independently owned, or that there were more independent newspapers back then, less corporate concentration?
Right. What a great question. I had not thought about that at all. I'm going to say yes. Although, again, that's a great question. I hadn't thought about that in terms of being able to not have to worry as much about corporate sponsors. I mean, certainly the higher ups in the newspaper are worried about advertising and getting their own kinds of pressure, but the New York City newspapers, not just the Times, which I focus on a lot today, but the New York City newspapers are just absolutely chock full of these protests. So they certainly felt like they had a pretty free hand to focus on this.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, I know just from my own research that the nature of the newspaper industry is changing really, really rapidly during this time with TV and people moving to the suburbs and all of that. So, I think there's also sort of, this is the national story, right? So they're going to cover it because that's what people are interested in. That's what they're paying attention. And newspapers can give more depth of coverage, say, than TV, right?
Mm-hmm.
So let's sort of switch it up a little bit and change it over to Bobby Kennedy, who everybody likes to talk about. So how do you assess CORE's criticisms of Kennedy? And it says that's a great debate. How behind the curve with civil rights were the Kennedys, if they were?
Yeah. You're going to see a lot more criticism coming from local branches than the national branch. Although, again, Farmer, who was the national chair of CORE, pretty critical in this speech and other speeches. He was really going after the Kennedy administration. I would say, from what I have seen, certainly the assassination of JFK is going to change how they're publicly talking about some of that. But really, in terms of Bobby Kennedy, the Kennedys were always seen as behind the curve. The kind of lionization of JFK as a huge supporter of the civil rights movement was really something that comes later. Johnson is able to use that pretty effectively at getting the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act passed, kind of painting JFK as a hero of the civil rights movement. And he did introduce, in June of 1963, introduce what would be the Civil Rights Act into Congress, but they were seen by grassroots activists as pretty behind the curve. RFK is able to, I would say, pretty safely by 1966, at least in what I'm seeing coming out of New York City, change that. And certainly by the time he's heading into his own presidential bid. And one of the things that Bobby Kennedy does, I think, pretty effectively is say he was wrong. And so he's going to do that on Vietnam. He's going to do that on civil rights. He's going to say we should have done more for civil rights. He's going to say, I was one of the people predicting victory in Vietnam. I was wrong. And so I think that younger activists by 66, 67, and certainly 68, supporting him in his presidential run before his assassination, feel like he's kind of come over to their side more. There are certainly local groups who can still be critical of the Kennedys, but as kind of time wears on in the 60s, I'm seeing less of that and more support for him.
Do you think the fragmenting of the movement, and I, in my own work, kind of see Birmingham as really a critical moment in that, right? Because it is the moment where lots of people break from nonviolence, and it does produce results. And so, and then after that, you have the big pieces of legislation, but you also have the fragmentation. Mm-hmm. How does that affect this kind of push and the push, to get corporations to follow suit and to work with labor and all of that? Because it becomes more radical.
It does, and it really does fall apart. And I think, again, if you're following the newspaper trail, I mean, the newspapers are a huge part of this story. The media, but especially the newspapers, are a huge part of this story. And as they turn against the movement and certainly become much more critical of the movement, even becoming much more critical of leaders like Martin Luther King. And I don't necessarily want to say he was considered a safe leader, because he was really hated by the white public all during his life, up until his assassination, and even some beyond that. I think King has been used since his murder as a weapon against other civil rights activists, much more so than the white community considered him during his life. But I do think that you see this, again, you have kind of these national organizations, and most of whom have headquarters in New York City, not all, but most of whom, who are trying very hard to stave off radicalization, certainly trying to keep to that nonviolent focus. But local activists are, like, I think splintering is a good way you can use that word to think about that, are really going their own path. They were always much more radical than the national offices, but you're seeing those local groups really kind of sometimes even leaving and forming their own kind of local organization. So it's less of a national tie-in. I think by 66, 67, I mean, certainly the March Against Fear that was trying to get people to actually register to vote. You see this real break. That's when the term Black Power first starts to get used. I mean, it's tough. And I don't think as historians we've really figured that out, because a lot of the goals of the Black Power movement, a lot of the people, a lot of the organizations had been around for a long time. And so the question is it just the media turning on the movement, or highlighting things that they think are new about the movement that weren't new about the movement. I mean, certainly in the South, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, its activists are oftentimes able to remain committed to nonviolence because they're being protected by a lot of African Americans and African American communities that are heavily armed. So, you know, I'm not sure I have a really great answer to that. But my work in New York City would certainly suggest that just to say that there's a splintering is accurate. People are still doing the work, and a lot of them are still saying the same things they were saying before, but the context has changed.
In terms of, you know, your work that begins kind of in the 30s, is it kind of like a gradual sort of coalescing and then the splintering? Or because the 30s are a radical time for labor,
Yeah.
there's a lot of push, or is it something where it's kind of splintered and then comes together and then sort of resplinters?
Yeah, what's interesting to me is that you do have such a radical movement in the 30s and really up through World War II that the Cold War kills. It's hard to, the people who were the most radical fighting for social justice issues, which included, you know, which oftentimes included race relations, those are people on the left. Those are people in the Communist Party. And once you get to the Cold War, calling for economic justice makes you sound like a communist. And so those people are getting pulled out, they're getting kind of purged from organizations. Organizations themselves can't use very radicalized language. They have to be really careful about what it is they say they're fighting for. And so I think in a lot of ways, the civil rights movement that we're getting starting in the late 40s up through really the early 60s is a pretty watered down movement. Like you, I think Birmingham is a huge turning point. King has been compelled with Birmingham by organizations like SNCC to become much more radical. Refusing to ride the bus is really a different kind of campaign than what's going on in Birmingham. Birmingham is laying your bodies out on the line in the streets, you and your children, day after day after day. And I think that the reaction to it is also so extreme that it's as if, to me, I think starting, I should say, in 1963, you're almost seeing the same kind of goals and articulation of the goals that you saw in the 1930s. And I think that I sometimes tell my students, it's, as it turns out, actually you kind of can fight City Hall, but fighting corporate America is much more difficult to do. And that's what we're seeing much more of. We're seeing by 1963, the economic racial injustice becoming much more prominently a part of the movement. And that's when corporate America and the federal government and white America just really kind of can't handle it anymore. And that just gets worse and worse and worse, especially as the Vietnam War is raging, and King speaks out against the Vietnam War. And, you know, everything is really splintering. I think in that way, it's not even just about the civil rights movement, but so many things in the 60s are.
Yeah, yeah. And please, for all of you, I certainly don't want to, I mean, Julie and I could talk about this all day. We have many times, but please do ask questions and follow up, and I would just kind of keep the conversation going. One of the things that, you know, thinking about the role of labor in these organizations, and, you know, your comment about fighting City Hall and fighting corporate America, it seems to me that if we compare that to today, where labor is so much weaker.
Yes.
And can you talk about that? I mean, what does that mean for today? What does the loss of that element mean?
Mm-hmm. But certainly the labor movement's support of civil rights, even as incomplete as it was, helps to legitimize these protests. It's a way for Black activists to say, this isn't just about us. This is about a system. I mean, how many times today are we talking about the system, right? They're able to talk about that and articulate that. And they have white allies, to use how we would call them in 2020, they have white allies who are saying, yes, we believe that. And because the movement is so large and so powerful, these unions can make a phone call and they've got hundreds of people showing up at a rally. A lot of the marches to the UN included particularly religious groups and labor groups. And they can kind of do that on a moment's notice. And I think that sadly, we didn't listen to a lot of labor activists in the 60s where they talked about how the white supremacy is about pitting the working class against itself. And I think that when that message is getting articulated by white labor activists, it's taken much more seriously. I say that, did it end it? No. But I do think that there's a legitimizing of civil rights protests when you can get hundreds of people from a labor union to show up, or you can get a labor leader to be quoted in the paper. And we don't have that. And I think that we're constantly seeing this pitting of the white and black and other groups, working classes, against one another. We see that all the time now.
It's interesting because we tend to use the term working class to mean white, but black people and people of color have been working class throughout American history, and so just in that very kind of unique term, sort of.
And that's being very clearly articulated by civil rights activists and labor leaders all throughout the 1950s and 60s. Some of my favorite speeches by Martin Luther King, there's this lovely article by James Baldwin where he's articulating, how white supremacy has been used to support a very unequal class system in the US. But studying the civil rights movement is also very depressing. Not a lot of people are able to do anything about it or do anything about it. So we're still seeing that today. And again, today, I think this is also one of the reasons why we have such a weakened labor movement. I think the conservative ascendance, which is really formulating in these years as well, and certainly being very visible nationally with the election of Nixon, that conservative backlash is going to be a big tent, and it's going to bring down the labor movement as well.
So question about sort of the move away from nonviolence and the increasing violence of protest action, post 63. To what extent was that violence committed by provocateurs used to blame and denigrate more militant groups that maybe had eschewed nonviolence?
Yeah, I think that was definitely happening. I also think that the rejection of nonviolence as a strategy, the movement wasn't then toward violence, it was toward self-defense, not being afraid to fight back. Your goal isn't just to take it and hope that that's pricking the conscience of white America. And so, there certainly are still many, many activists, of course, John Lewis, who we just lost this summer, stuck to the principle of nonviolence. For him, it wasn't a strategy, it was a very deeply held belief system. But for activists that saw that as a strategy, or maybe some who even believed it, but by the mid-1960s saw it going nowhere, that they're not, most of them are, and again, today that's just so overblown, I think, in the media and in DC about the violence of these protests. Most of the time what we're seeing, at least in the 60s, is the police and counter protesters, white America fighting back, and black activists simply just not laying down and taking it anymore, as opposed to themselves going out and acting violently. The Black Panthers, for all of their pictures walking around with guns, most of their programs focused on free lunch, free breakfast, education, getting voted into office. And so I think that that they were very provocative for appointed reasons, but it's kind of more of a perception than actually going out and seeking violence.
And all of this, whether it's sort of the Panthers and Black Power, or we generally recognized as the nonviolent, is there is a very savvy understanding of how to utilize media and how to present
Yes.
and identify.
Yeah. I mean, that's really Project C, right? They're, SCL King and SCLC have kind of, they're at a standstill in 1963. Where can we get things revved back up again? Birmingham. If we can make progress in Birmingham, in the most racist city in the US, holy cow, that'll be great. And if we can't, yeah, we're going to show people what this is like. And so that's exactly why they're going in. And this is the other thing too, is that these, again, Black New Yorkers are very media savvy. If we can show up with 50 people somewhere important, the chances are we're going to get in the newspaper. We're going to get the New York Times, and then we could be picked up, that we could get to AP, UPI. And again, I mean, I don't know if they knew they were showing up in Montana in the newspapers there, but they knew that they were in a really great position to shed light on some of these problems going on.
Yeah. Any other questions for Julia? It's fascinating stuff. Can you talk a little bit about sort of where you've done your research and kind of how this all came together and when we can see the book?
Sure.
No
Oh, God,
pressure.
I know. How many things am I going to give at the Byrd Center where you're going to introduce me as she's working on a media? And since I'm now basically homeschooling my daughters for the next year, who knows? But this actually all really started with me being interested in the consumer culture part of this. And in the 1930s, the kind of Madison Avenue and corporate America come up with what with a term, they call it the Negro market. They come up with this term to connote African Americans' consumption of corporate brand products. And they think, it's the Great Depression and we need consumers, and we've found these new people that we never thought about before. And so they start targeting African Americans in ways they never had before. And so my work initially started with that. What was that market? How is it being formulated? How were African Americans themselves responding to it? And so I decided to focus on New York City, since it's in the 1930s, both the capital of Black America and the capital of Madison Avenue. And so my work really has looked at how those forces are intertwining in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 1960s. It's a very segregated market. Markets can be very segmented, but this market is designed to be completely hidden from white America if brand products can get away with it. But you also have African Americans who are helping to create the idea of that market, trying to utilize that market to affect change in their own communities. Can we pressure these corporations to hire us? Can we become visible in American society? And so my story kind of goes up through the 1960s, when Black New Yorkers tell Madison Avenue that what they've created is another Jim Crow market, and they start actually picketing Madison Avenue because of that. So my work, I went to school in New England, did my PhD in New England, and again, I was really near New York City. So my work started really with the consumer culture side of this, but then I quickly found out the story was really about the politics of consumption. And I did most of my work at the Byrd Center, which is one of the New York Public Library archives. It's in Harlem, and then of course newspapers. I have been working on this for such a long time that I did all of my dissertation research on microfilm reels. I was just talking to someone the other day about having to take Dramamine because I would get so nauseous as the microfilm reel would go by and go by and go by. But how great it was. Now everything's digitized. You can just do searches for things, but you miss a lot if you do that. Really feeling like this Harlem that I was seeing in these newspapers was so different than the conception of what Harlem was, that I really felt like by looking at every day, it was 3 newspapers that came out weekly for 30 some years. You really felt like by looking at every single page that you got a sense of what the community was going through. And so again, I thought I was looking at the advertising industry, and it ended up being that I was actually looking at political activism, decades and decades and decades of political activism, very savvy political activism. And, you know, again, it's not a happy story. Being a historian of the civil rights movement is not something that makes me feel good about the world on a daily basis, but this could not be a more timely topic, as you kind of started us off by saying. And I try to, as I teach a lot of this to my students, I bring all of this into every class, no matter what it is. And I try to tell them, you know, you got to be in this for the long haul. Most of these activists did not see a lot of change in their lifetimes, but they continued to do it. So.
Yeah, we tend to forget that, you know, this window is just the window that you're talking about is, you know, much longer and steeper than we tend to even remember it. I mean, it's 10 years between the Brown decision and the Civil Rights Act. You know, that's a long time to be out in the streets. There's no doubt. So one question is kind of come in that, you know, actually is really interesting. And you mentioned the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and how that was cited by the activists. Were they kind of pushing for the ratification of the articles on economic rights that are in that?
Absolutely. And in fact, starting with the founding of the UN in the late 1940s, a number of Black rights organizations in the US try to take their case to the UN. And always included in that is economic justice, not just social and political rights, but economic rights and economic justice as well. And they're not really ever successful, but they certainly get a lot of attention. Trying, as the Cold War is heating up as well, the UN is a critique from the outside, and that is seen by every administration as very dangerous. And the activists are not afraid to go after. They go after Eleanor Roosevelt. You've seen them go after the Kennedys. I mean, the people that we kind of hold up as whites who are champions of improved race relations and social justice and even economic justice aren't doing enough, according to these activists. In the late, I think it's the late 40s, maybe early 50s, Eleanor Roosevelt is on the national board of the NAACP, and the NAACP is trying to launch a suit, basically, to get the UN involved about racial injustice in the U.S. I mean, they're not afraid to be really critical and very smartly using the Cold War. There have been a lot of historians who've written about the use of the Cold War by Black rights groups. I mean, it's also dangerous territory, because if you're speaking out against the U.S. government, you're a traitor, and you're helping the communists. But a lot of Black rights organizations are really able to pretty effectively use the Cold War to say, how are we going to claim to be the leader of the free world if this is what's going on in the U.S.? And I mean, there are historians who've argued that decisions like Brown versus Board of Education are brought to us, in fact, by the Cold War. And the State Department and another one of the federal agencies, they write Friends of the Court briefs in support of Brown versus Board of Education, because they know how this makes us look to the newly emerging independent nations in Africa and Asia and Southeast Asia. And so in the context of the Cold War, we need to get our act together.
Yeah. And these activists that are in New York understand that, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
oh, absolutely. That's some of my favorite protests are this kind of marching, and the New York Times always makes a big deal of how far they marched from wherever they were to the UN or the South African consulate, delivering petitions. There's one, I didn't use this article in the presentation, but there's this one of activists handing a petition to the secretary at the South African consulate, and the top says, like, South African consulate out to lunch, because she had told the activists no one was there, they were out to lunch, but she would take their petition and pass it along. And the UN is very heavily used by Black activists in New York City.
Interesting. Wonderful. Any final questions for Julia? This has been great. I mean, just really interesting, and it's just been fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you all for joining in and participating, and your great questions. We very much appreciate it. This series has been timely and informative, and just really well received. So we look forward to conducting more talks through the end of the summer and the fall, and you'll certainly be getting notice of those in the next week or so from the Byrd Center. So thank you very much. Have a great evening. I don't think it's raining yet, so I will get to walk home without.
I've started hearing thunder where I am, but I don't think there's any rain out there yet. So.
Okay, well, thank you all. We very much appreciate it, and I will talk to you all soon.